Good morning. It is Wednesday, September the 11th, and this is The Drill. Thank you very much. This is Ron, your host, and today is going to be a short, to-the-point broadcast, and it's basically a remembrance of 9/11/2001. And I'm going to be reading from a book that's called The Only Plane in the Sky. I'm going to be reading the author's note and a chapter that's called Aboard the International Space Station. So here we go. Author's note. Nearly every American above a certain age remembers precisely where they were on September 11th, 2001. What began as an ordinary day became the deadliest terrorist attack in world history and the deadliest attack on the United States since Pearl Harbor. Shocking and terrifying the global community, exposing us to unimaginable tragedy and evil, while also reminding us of the strength, bravery, and power of the human spirit. Heroes quite literally emerged from the ashes, and the hours and decisions that followed define not just a generation, but our modern era. All told, 2,606 people died at the World Trade Center in New York City, and another 125 at the Pentagon. 206 people died when their planes, American Airlines Flight 77, United Airlines Flight 175, American Airlines Flight 11, flight numbers now permanently retired and part of history, were hijacked and crashed into the centers of America's financial and military power. Another 40 died in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, as brave passengers and crew wrestled control of United Flight 93 back from the hijackers. The 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York City honors a precise tally of 2,983 casualties, including 6 killed in 1993 when the World Trade Center was attacked for the first time by the forerunners of the terror group that would ultimately bring these buildings down in just 102 minutes 8 years later. The 9/11 victims represented not merely Americans, but citizens of more than 90 nations. The toll obviously stretched beyond the dead alone. More than 3,000 children lost a parent on 9/11, including some 100 children who were born in the subsequent months and would never meet their fathers. Upwards of 6,000 people were injured, and many more would face injuries, some physical, some psychological, some eventually fatal, stemming from the recovery work. Far beyond the official numbers, however, the attacks affected nearly every American alive that day, and hundreds of millions, if not billions, beyond our shores, as news of the attacks was broadcast the world over. I've spent 3 years collecting the stories of those who lived through and experienced 9/11, where they were, what they remember, and how their lives changed. The book that follows is based on more than 500 oral histories conducted by me, as well as dozens of other historians and journalists over the last 17 years. I'm deeply grateful for their work and their understanding that history would want and need these stories recorded. Collectively, these narratives help make sense of a day that we, as a country and as a people, are still trying to process. In her oral history of the day, Eve Butler Gee, who on 9/11 was a clerk in the U.S. House of Representatives, remarked on how fascinated Americans are by their own memories of that day. Quote, "I've noticed we don't listen to each other's stories. We need to tell our story. Someone will start saying, well, I was such and such, and the other person will interrupt and talk over and say, well, I was so-and-so. The shock, in many ways, is still embedded in our memories that this thing happened on our shores in the places where we felt the safest," unquote. Her observation rang true to me throughout this project, as every mention of 9/11 to friends or acquaintances immediately prompted people to pour out their own stories, often with heart-wrenching intimacy. This book is an attempt to listen, to hear others' stories, to know what it was like to experience the day firsthand, to wrestle with the confusion and the terror. The Only Plane in the Sky is not meant to be a precise account of how and why September 11 occurred. Groups like the 9/11 Commission devoted years of work and millions of dollars to provide those answers. Instead, this book intends to capture how Americans lived that day, how the attacks in New York City, at the Pentagon, and in the skies over Somerset County, Pennsylvania, rippled across lives from coast to coast, from the Twin Towers to an elementary school in Sarasota, Florida, and how government and military officials on Capitol Hill, at the White House, in mountain bunkers, at air traffic control centers, and in the cockpit of fighter planes responded in an unprecedented moment to unimaginable horrors. To construct this book, I worked for 2 years with Jenny Pachuki, an oral historian who has dedicated her career to stories of September 11th and who located for me about 5,000 relevant oral histories collected and archived around the country. We closely read or listened to about 2,000 of those stories to identify the voices and memories featured here. As part of that, I've drawn upon interviews and exhaustive work from the National September 11th Museum and Memorial and the 9/11 Tribute Museum, the Flight 93 National Memorial near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the September 11th Education Trust, the U.S. House of Representatives Historian's Office, C-SPAN, the Arlington County, Virginia Public Library, the Fire Department of the City of New York, the Historical Office of the Secretary of Defense, the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Coast Guard, the 9/11 Commission, the Museum of Chinese in America, Columbia University, Stony Brook University, and other repositories, as well as a host of snippets and transcripts culled from news articles, magazine profiles, pamphlets, videos, documentaries, collections ranging from the trial exhibits of 9/11 conspirator Zacarias Moussaoui to a compilation published by America Online of its users' thoughts, posts, and memories of 9/11, and countless other books, including 3 that deserve specific mention for their usefulness. Mitchell Fink and Lois Mathias's terrific 2002 collection of oral histories, Never Forget, as well as 2 works focused on the 9/11 New York maritime boat lift, Mike McGee's All Available Boats, and Jessica DeLong's Dust to Deliverance. To supplement those existing archival primal sources, I've also collected several hundred interviews, personal reflections, and stories myself, about 75 of which are featured here. I'm grateful to all those who shared their stories. Among these hundreds of memories collected as early as September 2001 and as recently as the spring of 2019, the chronologies and stories don't always line up neatly. Perspectives differ and images blur with time. Traumatic memories especially are fallible. I've done my best to line things up according to the facts and timelines available. All interviews have been condensed and edited for clarity. Throughout the book, all titles, occupations, locations, and ranks are accurate to that moment. Additionally, for ease of reading and historical accuracy, I've edited some quotations to make verb tenses consistent and made minor factual corrections. For instance, where a speaker misremembered a name or title, such as calling the speaker pro tem the president pro tem, or misstating what floor the Sky lobbies in the Trade Center were on, and standardized some place names, code words, and other references that would otherwise be more confusing than illuminating. While The Only Plane in the Sky is comprehensive, it is not complete. These stories capture only a single moment in time, and part of what makes 9/11 so poignant is learning how people fared in the days, weeks, months, and years thereafter. 2 key players on that day, Bernard Kerik, Commissioner of the New York Police Department, and Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert, would both end up in prison, for instance. As a nation united in solidarity after the attacks, it also descended into 2 wars that continue to this day and reshaped multiple corners of the world. Thus, 9/11 remains a daily presence in our national politics and our international geopolitics, and it fundamentally changed the way we live, travel, and interact with one another. As Rosemary Dillard, an American Airlines manager in D.C., whose husband Eddie was aboard one of the hijacked flights, said, quote, "I still think that we all walk on eggshells. I don't think that the young people who will be reading this will know the same freedom I knew growing up," unquote. Today, that new generation Dillard mentions barely remembers the day itself. 2018 marked the first year military recruits born after 9/11 were deployed to war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the fall of 2019 will mark the entrance of the first college class born after the attacks. That passage of time makes remembering 9/11 all the more important. Indeed, to understand all that came after, we must first understand what it was like to live through the drama and tragedy that began under the crisp, clear blue skies of Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. Aboard the International Space Station. On August 12, 2001, NASA astronaut Frank Culbertson arrived at the International Space Station aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery. He would live and work aboard the space station for 125 days. On September 11, 2001, he was the only American off the planet. Commander Frank Culbertson, astronaut, NASA. On September 11, 2001, I called the ground and my flight surgeon, Steve Hart, came on. I said, "Hey, Steve, how's it going?" He said, "Well, Frank, we're not having a very good day down here on Earth." He began to describe to me what was happening in New York. The airplanes flown into the World Trade Center, another airplane flown into the Pentagon. He said, "We just lost another airplane somewhere in Pennsylvania. We don't know where or what's happening." I looked at the laptop that has our world map on it, and I saw that we were coming across southern Canada. In a minute, we were going to be over New England. I raced around, found a video camera, and a window facing in the right direction. About 400 miles away from New York City, I could clearly see the city. It was a perfect weather day all over the United States, and the only activity I could see was this big black column of smoke coming out of the New York City, over Long Island and over the Atlantic. As I zoomed in with a video camera, I saw this big gray blob, basically enveloping the southern part of Manhattan. I was seeing the second tower come down. I assumed tens of thousands of people were being hurt or killed. It was horrible to see my country under attack. We had 90 minutes to set up for the next pass across the United States. We set up every camera we could. I said, "Guys, we're going to take pictures of everything we can see as we come across the U.S." An hour and a half later, we crossed Chicago. I was looking all around for any evidence of further attacks. I could see all the way to Houston. In a few minutes, we crossed Washington, D.C., directly over the Pentagon. I could look straight down and see the gash on the side of it. I could see the lights of the rescue vehicles, the smoke of the fires. Looking north, I could clearly see New York City and the column of smoke. Every orbit, we kept trying to see what more was happening. One of the most startling effects was that within about 2 orbits, all the contrails normally crisscrossing the United States had disappeared because they had grounded all the airplanes and there was nobody else flying in U.S. airspace except for one airplane that was leaving a contrail from the central U.S. toward Washington. That was Air Force One heading back to D.C. with President Bush. And that was the author's note and the report of Mr. Culbertson from the International Space Station on from the book, The Only Plane in the Sky, a remembrance of 9/11, September 11th, 2001. And that brings me to another episode of The Drill. And until next time, thank you very much for listening and have a great day.